All right, hi everybody. Today or tonight, I want to talk to you about rainforests. Specifically, I want to talk about tropical rainforests. Now, having said that, I quickly want to mention that there are really many different types of rainforests that are lumped into this category. For example, at Olympic National Park in Washington, we have what's called a Pacific temperate rainforest, or just a temperate rainforest. And then in parts of, say, South Australia and New Zealand, we have also what are called temperate rainforests. But mostly what I want to talk about tonight are the tropical rainforests. When we talk about tropical rainforests, we're typically talking about the forests that lie on the equator and either between 23.5 degrees or so north of the equator and about the same latitude, 23.5 degrees south of the equator, that is basically bordered by the Tropic of Cancer in the north and the Tropic of Capricorn in the south. So large amounts of rainforests are going to therefore fall in places like South America, Central Africa, and Indonesia and Northern Australia. When you talk about tropical rainforest, two important variables, and there's a couple of others I'll mention later, but the two probably most important variables are going to be rainfall for one and temperature as a second one. So those are the typical variables that we'll talk about. Now, if you look at this graph, you can kind of see some of the other elements at play. So in the upper right-hand corner, this is another way to sort of display different biomes of the world. We have our tropical rainforests that tend to be very, very high in the annual precipitation rate. That's the rainfall, and also higher, if you would, on the temperature scale. And they tend to have very large amounts of rainfall. Down from the tropical rainforest, where we have temperate rainforests, tend to be not quite as warm and also tend to not get quite as much rain. The other thing I'll mention is that even on the equator, in a what we call the tropics belt, if you would, you can get things like cloud forests because maybe you get a lot of rainfall, but if the altitude of the particular landmass is high in that area, it's going to be much cooler than it would be, say, at sea level. So you get things like cloud forests, and you also get things like tropical dry forests that are in the tropics, but they're shielded from rain for one reason or another. And so they might have some of the characteristics of tropical rainforests, but not always exactly the same. When you talk about tropical rainforests, the topic of concern is quite often that of deforestation. So there's a couple of causes that exacerbate, if you will, the deforestation rate that makes it far more serious than, say, other places. One, as the population growth occurs, there's more and more demand on that space and those nutrients. We're going to talk a little bit about some of these other things like slash and burn, agriculture and logging and that sort of thing. So we're going to hit upon several of these elements as we go through, trying to explain why there's a problem with deforestation and what kind of impacts that's having on the world. So the consequences of deforestation are, as you remove these rainforests, one of the things that you'll tend to lose very quickly, and we'll talk about this more in a second, is you get soil erosion. And when you get soil erosion in an area, you tend to lose the nutrients that are in that area, and that turn your habitat in that spot into more of a desert region. We call this desertification. That's the transformation of a space or land into one that's more like a desert. Now, personally, I like deserts. Really, what's more of the issue is you're taking a place that wasn't a desert before and you're converting it into an unnatural place that's a desert in that region. And that's the problem. Loss of wildlife due to extinction's another problem. Loss of genetic diversity, loss of species that are of unknown value. We'll talk about that in a second. Displacement of indigenous people and loss of reliable water supply. So these are all some of the consequences related to deforestation in tropical rainforests. Okay, so if you take a look at one of the tributaries of the Amazon River, and you notice there's no roads or anything. This is a habitat that's basically pristine tropical rainforest with almost no development of any sort in this region. And that is what it's supposed to look like if there's no harvesting of wood and things of that sort. Now, one of the things that most people, I think, without knowing any better, would assume that there's a lot of nutrients in the soil. In fact, when Europeans first came to the tropics, they thought there was going to be a ton of nutrients in the soil where you could grow crops and things like that. But it's actually not true. It's exactly the opposite of what you might think. So if you go to a tropical rainforest and you go down to the base of the roots of the trees, and you can move the leaf litter and things out of the way, one of the things you'll find is that the roots are kind of right near the surface, and they really aren't very, very deep. And part of that is because when it rains, there's so much rain that it would wash the nutrients away. They never soak in to the soil. Tropical rainforests have evolved under the conditions to absorb as many nutrients as they can right on the surface. Now, this is a place in Costa Rica where upstream there was some logging and deforestation going on. And so what you can see here again in Costa Rica, all this brown here is all topsoil that's washing away. And there's sort of a joke in some of these areas that in the tropics, like in Costa Rica, that the biggest export, the greatest export is topsoil, because first of all, it's not a tremendously useful resource, the topsoil, because there's not a lot of nutrients in it anyway, but also because it's being washed away if you cut it down, if you remove it. Further upstream, this is a place where there's no deforestation. You notice the water is much clearer. There's not all these sediments in it. And that's because the surrounding forests absorb all the nutrients in the water. Interesting fact, one single large tree in a big storm can pick up 57,000 gallons of water that otherwise would be washing away the soil. Now, the next thing I want to mention is what's called slash and burn agriculture in order to grow crops in a particular area. So what people would do is they would clear a small area and they would burn the vegetation there. And we call that slash and burn agriculture, because when you burn that area and you open it up to sunlight, you put nutrients in the soil in that spot. And then what you can do is grow your crops on it. So this is a location, for example, where slash and burn agriculture is happening and being practiced by indigenous people that typically don't have large equipment and things of that sort. They're clearing a fairly small area and burning it and then growing their crops on it. They might do that in that one region for a couple of years before they move on to another spot, because you end up losing the nutrients in the soil. So although you do lose some rainforest when indigenous groups do this type of slash and burn agriculture, it's very important to point out that this is such a small scale when done by indigenous people, because they typically don't have large equipment and power tools and things of that sort. So the indigenous practice of slash and burn agriculture has had very little impact on it. What's the problem is the much larger scale. And I'll give you an example of that. In Madagascar, located here, which is a biodiversity hotspot right off the coast of Africa. And you see the equator in the picture, so you can see that you're just south of the equator by, in that case, the Tropic of Capricorn. And this is some large scale slash and burn agriculture in Madagascar. This was taken by NASA about 20 years ago. And each little red dot shows you where there's a fire happening. And what ends up occurring is you end up with things like this. So these mountains were once all forest in Madagascar. Now, this is not indigenous people doing this. This is large scale corporations that are doing the slash and burn agriculture, but at 10,000 times the size. And it's not sustainable, obviously. As you can see here, all the forest is gone in that case. So Madagascar's lost something like 85 to 90% of their tropical forests. You can see right here in 1953, where the tropical forests covered a significant part of the East Coast. And then by 1973, and by 1990, and then by 2014, you can see it's a tremendously different case. Another place this is happening, the island of Borneo off the coast of Indonesia, right on the equator again. So we're in that tropic belt. And this is a picture of Borneo, and you can see these huge forest areas that have been cleared out of the way. All the brown is basically where there's no more forest. What's happening here is you're having the same sort of slash and burn agriculture practice, but specifically what they're growing here. So this is a palm oil plantation. And what's happening is they're cutting down the forest and growing these palm trees so they can produce palm oil. And this gives you an example that used to be tropical lowland forest. And you can see huge amounts of it are gone to make room for these palm oil plantations. And this is what you get. These are the palm trees being harvested. You notice there are all these palm trees on the right and left of this road. And you have this logging truck taking these palm plants to the oil plantation to harvest the oil in them. Part of the reason that's a problem is biodiversity. For example, if you had an undisturbed tropical rainforest in Borneo, many studies have shown in those areas you can have up to 200 or greater species of resident birds in that forest. And then if you cut that down and then look at what's there, if you plant nothing but palms, you end up with 9 to 12 species of resident birds. So they're not all gone, but you're talking like, 90% of the birds are gone. In a tropical forest, there's all these many different types of trees. And when you cut that down and plant your palm plants, they're all going to be a monoculture of one kind of plant, obviously. So why is palm oil so popular, you might wonder? You buy vegetable oil to cook with. What you may not know is a significant amount of vegetable oil actually comes from palm oil. But it's also inexpensive. So you can grow a lot of it. It grows really, really quick. It's highly productive. It'll grow in many different types of soils. It's very efficient. It's very versatile. So there's some benefits monetarily, but it does have tremendous ecological negative aspects to it. Okay. Now, the other thing that's happening is many of these rainforest regions, say particularly in South America and Central America, is it has been sort of more recently discovered that there's oil in parts of that. And oil exploration then ends up being another economically valuable commodity that is encroaching on these tropical forests. And in some of these places, this might surprise you, but particularly in the Amazon region, there's over 100 different groups of indigenous people that live there that are what are referred to as uncontacted tribes. Uncontacted tribe is one that either has never been contacted, which is very, very rare. So most of the uncontacted people fall in the category in which maybe they've met some anthropologists, but they don't have sustained contact. So there's lots of places in the world, particularly in the Amazon, where you have these groups of native people that kind of are doing their own thing and they're living on the land. So there's an ethical issue with oil exploration. And in some cases, as I'll mention in a second, they don't want to be contacted. The other thing is often these cultures have been isolated for so long that their immune systems can be very, very different from people that live in developed parts of the world. And so we can easily go and visit some of these places and you can wipe out a whole tribe of indigenous people very, very quickly with a very simple disease that they've never come in contact with. So this particular group of people that you see on this island, North Sentinel Island, that is kind of in the middle of the ocean in the Bay of Bengal, sort of off the coast of India and Thailand, kind of between those two, but kind of remote. And these people are the Sentinelese, and this is thought to be probably the most uncontacted group of people in the world. We know very little about them. So one of the last times people tried to contact them, they got into a little argument, and the Sentinelese killed one of the tour guides. They have their own language, and they suspect they've probably been isolated for, over 1,000 years. So number one is we have indigenous people that live in these areas, much like, you could say the Aboriginals of Australia or the Native Americans of North America. And one argument should be, I think, that these are people living in a particular culture in a particular way that maybe we shouldn't just go destroy. Also, these rainforests do a lot of carbon sequestering. They do a lot of photosynthesis. And there's also a lot of species that are found in these tropical rainforests. So even though tropical rainforests represent only about 6% of the total volume of land in the world, they have at least 50% of the species on the planet. 25% of all our pharmaceuticals contain chemicals from rainforest plants, and only 1% of these have been tested for medicinal purposes. 2/3 of cancer medications come from rainforest plants. In fact, childhood leukemia, there's a plant in Madagascar, a periwinkle, Madagascar periwinkle, and it's grown all over the world, but it's either extinct or it's endangered in Madagascar. The compounds found in the periwinkle have allowed to improve the survival rates of childhood leukemia from 10%. Survival rate used to be 10%, now all the way up to 90%. So it's obviously a highly effective drug. It's our plant now because we grow it all over the world. But the point is only 1% have been tested. There's probably all kinds of potential medication uses that we haven't even found yet from that. So there's several different chemical compounds. One of those produced by Eli Lilly is vinblastine, and another one called vincristine is manufactured by Pfizer. You can see the molecular structures here and how they're very similar, but there's just slight differences in them. Anyway, these have been used to treat a variety of different types of cancer. And so just a couple of interesting facts. When you talk about rainforests, up to 66% of the species kind of depends on, if you remember back in the beginning, we don't really know how many species there are. So there's some debate on this. So 50% is on the low end, all the way up to 70%. But we're still cutting it down at around 2,000 trees per minute. We lose about a football field a second. Currently, we're losing something like 3 to 4 species per hour. Many of those are tropical animals. Many of them are insects. You see something around the order of 80% of all insect species are found in tropical rainforests. Okay, so hopefully gained a greater appreciation for the importance of tropical rainforests in the world. And I will talk to you all later. Have a good night.